in this chapter, this objective, excuse me, what we're going to look at is the fractional banking reserve and how that actually creates money in our money supply. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. I think I have to still kind of queue up my PowerPoint, but I'll go ahead and do that. All right, let's see from beginning. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how banks create money in a fractional reserve system. Again, that's the system that we use here in the United States. So fractional reserve banking works like this. For every deposit that the Federal Reserve Bank takes in, they have to isolate a certain percentage of that. We'll call that the reserve ratio. It's set by the Fed, and they have to isolate that and send it to the Fed. So again, kind of going back to our example, if I bank at Chemical and I deposit $500 into my checking account. Okay, so let's see, let's do this a little bit differently and change that up. So hold on, let me put myself in here. Control P. All right, so I deposit $500 into my checking account. So what happens is when I do that, Chemical Bank has to isolate the required reserve ratio. For ease of use, I'll just say, let's say that's set at 10%, which is pretty high, but let's just say. Chemical then takes 10% times the 500, which would be just simply moving it a decimal place over, $50. Chemical then has to isolate $50 and send that to the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. And it's kind of put in a banking account for Chemical. Chemical then can take that remainder, the excess reserves, 450, just the 500 that I deposited less the 50, and they can lend that back out and make money from it. So again, what's the minimum amount that the reserves that the banks must hold? And that's going to be set by the Fed, and that's going to be the reserve ratio. And we'll just call the reserve ratio big letter R, okay? All right, so how does the Fed use that? Well, if the Fed increases the required reserve ratio, what essentially that means is that banks have less money to loan out. So what happens to the money supply is it will decrease. It decreases the money supply. If they decrease the required reserve ratio, they can loan out more money, which will increase the money supply. So that's basically how this required reserve ratio works. So here's an example. Now, excess reserve would be, in my example, I just gave you the $450. But sometimes banks have to hold reserves above, banks may hold, above that legal requirement. So in this case, the banks could loan back out the 450, but sometimes they choose to hold excess reserves because, again, they might be making more types of loans which are more susceptible to risk. So here's an example. The required reserve ratio is going to be 10%. Notice the deposits that it takes in, $100. We're going to multiply that by the 10%. And that would give us the $100. On the other side, the bank has to put that on reserve at the Fed. So there's your $10. And they can loan back out the 90. That's their reserves that they may want to loan out. They, however, could keep more, and that's where we get this idea of excess reserves. Okay. Again, banks only hold a fraction of deposits in reserve. And again, as the banks create money by lending out excess, then what happens is we'll increase the money supply. Again, it doesn't increase wealth because we're not talking about investment at this point. Now, What's interesting is how exactly does this work when we're talking about many, many different banks. So I'm going to kind of go back to this idea. And let's say that Chemical loans back out the 450 to an individual who's wanting to buy a car. Okay. Now we're looking at investment because you see the car is the underlying asset. So they lend the 450, they charge some kind of interest rate. That person will then give the loan to GM, maybe General Motors. General Motors will then go put that in their account. And that Chemical bank again has to isolate 10% of the 450 or $45. Then they can loan back out the rest. So this is what we mean by fractional reserve banking. So here's the example using, again, the $100 that we started with at a 10% required reserve ratio. That's what they must put in of any deposit. So the first time that that happened, remember that the First National Bank would isolate the 10% or $100. They would, I'm sorry, $10. And then what they could do is loan back out the remainder. So the $10 goes to the Fed. They can loan back out the 90. Somebody then deposits that in the Second National Bank. They too have to isolate 10%. So that goes to the Fed, and they can loan back out the remainder. That person then deposits it in an account, isolates 10%. The bank does, the Third National. So this goes to the Fed, and then they can turn around and loan the rest back out. This idea of continuing to loan out here and here is what actually increases the money supply through the fractional banking reserve. Now, how much does it increase? And there's a really quick, easy way to figure this out. And what we use is what we call the money multiplier, okay? The money multiplier is equal to 1 over the required reserve ratio times the amount of the deposit. Okay, so our original deposit was $100, right? So let's see how much money is created in the money supply as a result. So remember, we were using a 10% required reserve ratio. 1 over 10% is equal to 10. We take the original deposit of $100, multiply that by the money multiplier of 10, and that ends up creating $1,000 in the money supply. So in this case, the money supply would increase by a total of $1,000. Okay, now again, just kind of showing you the math in the previous step. You want to be very careful when you read these questions, because sometimes we will ask the question, how much is created? And then we will also ask, how much is in the supply? So I want to show you how the difference of these two questions, what really the difference is in the money supply. Okay, so let's take a look at how you would answer these two questions and the difference. So we know that the money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio. In this case, again, it's going to be 10%. 1 over 0.10 is 10. Again, we multiply that by the original deposit, in this case, $100. And then we would say we have $1,000. But it doesn't stop there. Because we're asking the creation of money, we have to subtract out the original deposit to just look at new money created. So $900 is the right answer there. It is not $1,000. How much money is in the money supply? Then we would go ahead and do the same thing. 1 over the required reserve ratio times the original, equals 10, times the 100. We would say $1,000 is in the money supply. We do not subtract out. So notice and be very careful as you're answering these questions. If it's saying how much has been created or will be created, make sure you subtract the original deposit because it was already in the money supply. If it's saying how much is in the money supply, meaning the total money supply, you don't subtract the deposit. So that's a really important distinction to make. Okay. All right. Okay, so again, what is the money multiplier? And that's going to be 1 over the required reserve ratio, whatever it is. The higher the ratio, the smaller the multiplier. So as the required reserve ratio increases, the money multiplier will decrease, right? Because the money supply is decreasing as well. All right, let's take a hand at this. While cleaning your apartment, you look under the sofa cushion and you find a $50 bill. Bill, most liquid, so that would be part of which one, M1 or M2? If you answered M1, you are correct. You deposit it into your checking account. The Federal Reserve requirement is 20% of deposit. Here's our first question. What's the maximum amount that the money supply could increase? Now, again, it's asking about the increase, so I'm definitely going to make sure I subtract out that original deposit. So I'm going to figure out the money multiplier. 1 over the required reserve ratio. So that's 1 over 0.20, which equals 5. I'm going to multiply that by the original deposit, 50, and I end up with 250. That's not really what the question asked. It said could increase. So I have to subtract out the 50 of the original deposit, and I get $200. So according to the fractional reserve system, the maximum amount that the money supply could increase would be $200. We also use the word could because not every bank is going to loan out all of its excess reserves. They might keep some of it. Okay, next question. What's the minimum amount that the money supply could increase? Okay, so we just did the maximum amount using the money multiplier. So let's do what's the minimum amount. Now, don't forget, yes, we're talking about fractional reserve right now, but there are 2 other systems. There is 100% reserve banking, there's 0%, and then there's what we use, fractional reserve. So what's the minimum amount the money supply could increase? Well, if we deposit $50 and we're in a command economy where 100% of that has to be put in the central bank, then the minimum amount that the money supply could increase would be 0. Okay, because you have to think ahead that there are different types of central banking systems. Okay, so again, here's what we looked at. So the increase in the money supply for A, the maximum amount was $200. The minimum amount, nothing, because 100% reserves. Okay. At this point, what we're going to do is turn our focus a little bit to talk about the financial crisis because banks were at the center of the financial crisis. So here is the resources a bank owns are bank capital, and they use that to generate profit. All right, so here is a more realistic balance sheet of a bank. This is the amount of the reserves that it has at the Fed. This is the amount that it has in loans to customers. So it's collecting interest on that. And then securities. Banks can own securities. So this would be considered an asset to the bank, and they might be using those to invest. The amount of deposits it has are a liability to the bank because people could come and draw those back out. So that's why that's a liability. How much debt does the bank itself have and take on? And then this is the owners of the bank, their owner's equity. So the actual owners have capital in the bank as well. Bank leverage is how much it has, when we take a look at what does it own versus what does it owe. So for example, a leverage ratio looks at the amount of debt that a bank has to the amount of equity that the bank has. You might have had this done on you if you were going to lend. The maximum amount of debt to equity is usually 32%. And that's even you're living paycheck to paycheck. Capital requirement is the minimum amount of bank capital. So they, like ourselves, if you go down to get a loan, then what's going to happen is they're going to look at everything you owe versus everything you own, and it can't be greater than 32%. So there's a capital requirement that banks, according to the Dodd-Frank Act, sets, and that is set at the federal level. Now, what happens if a bank loans out more? And this is really kind of important because if the value of the bank's assets drop below its liabilities, then the bank becomes insolvent. This happened a lot during the financial crisis, and I have a thing coming up in just a moment. So what happens is we want banks to remain solvent. We don't want the Fed to come in and be that lender of last resort and bail banks out. Since 2008, the Fed also engages into short-term loans to banks. It also might buy back some of the troublesome loans to make that debt to equity ratio different. Okay, if a bank's assets rise in value by 5%, this is not so bad, but let's say the leverage rate is 20. So what we do is we take the $1,000 of assets, multiply that by the 5%, which would be $50. That's where we end up with this $10.50. Bank capital rises from 50 to 100. Why 50 to 100? 50 times the 20 would give us the 100. Okay, so a 5% increase, it increases the owner's equity by 100%. If a bank's assets are reduced, then the same process kind of starts. We take $1,000 times the 0.05, which gives us $50, but this is now a loss. Notice how it was added last time. So 1,000 minus the 50 gives us the assets worth $950. Okay, now when we take a look at that, we go, okay, 50 times the 20 is a 100% change. And this is why the value to the owners falls to zero, because it leads to 100% fall in bank capital. Now, what happens if banks' assets are reduced in value by more than 5%? Some people who borrow from the bank might default. Leverage ratio of 20, then we have the assets falling below the liabilities, they can't pay, and the bank becomes insolvent. And this is where the Fed would step in and try to save the bank. Depositors have federal deposit insurance, FDIC, you've heard of, I'm sure, which we increased in 2008. Little historical context, in 2009, there were actually 140 bank failures. The prior year, there were only 25. And here's the deal, from 2006 and 5, there weren't any at all. So this is part of what led into the financial crisis, because a lot of banks couldn't and were engaging in some risky, very risky types of investments in mortgage loans and backed securities. The shortage of capital, we reduced lending, we had the credit crunch, and again, the downturn in the economy. Now, the Fed did step in and rescue some banks, Bank of America, and it let others fail, like Lehman. Okay, So again, what did the Fed do? The Fed temporarily made the U.S. taxpayer part of many banks and again recapitalized the banking system. We did have some rules in place prior to, to 1997. So after in 1932, there was a uh, act that was passed. It was called the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act said that banks really could not engage in speculative investing. Now, what happened is this act was repealed in 1992, I believe. And so this made banks multinational, and when they were able to kind of compete with other banks like Deutsche Bank in Germany, Bank of England in England, and so Bank of America, large banks here in the US wanted to be like multinationals. So this is why the act was repealed. Interestingly enough, after the economic collapse of 2008, we have the Dodd-Frank Act, which looked a lot like Glass-Steagall, but it was much broader in scope and narrowed banks' focus. Okay, so this is the end of this learning objective, and hopefully you understand now a fractional reserve system and how banks actually create money through the process of lending. It's not like we print money. Through the process of deposits and lending back out, that's actually how the money supply increases, or if they raise the required reserve ratio, decreases. I'll see you back in the next objective to talk about the tools of the Fed. Thanks. Have a great day.